Let me first introduce myself. So my name is Anika Gearhart Edwards, and I am a psychology instructor here at Leeward Community College. I hold my PhD from University of Hawaii at Manoa in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. So I am both a scientist and an instructor. So I want to share with you some tips and tricks for writing good science. And science and writing don't always go hand in hand together. People can be very good scientists and very poor writers. And so this is actually a very important skill for folks who want to go into science, and it's not necessarily emphasized as much as it should be. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. So as I mentioned, my name is Anika Gearhart Edwards. I have a PhD in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. I specifically studied multisensory integration and attention, specifically joint attention, which is just like a fancy way of saying I looked at how people work together to put information in their brains. And science writing was a big shift for me. So I was an English and psychology major, double major in college. And I was used to writing for fun and creatively and to persuade or excite people. But in science, we actually want to write to inform. So the goal is not to be interesting, but to communicate information clearly. And that often requires a really big mental shift for folks because we're used to writing something that's interesting, right? That's the goal when we're writing usually is to engage people. But we don't necessarily need to be engaging when we write a scientific article or we write something scientific, but we do have to be really clear, right? We're trying to get information across. So I'd like to actually start, and this will be an engaging session. So I do expect you to participate actively. I would just like to know your name and then one goal you have for your writing this semester. So what would you like to accomplish with your writing? And just in the chat box is fine. And then to get to the chat box at the bottom, you can just click on the ribbon and then chat. So again, we're thinking about what is the goal that we have for writing this semester. Or you can also think of what is something you want to get out of the session, right? So there's probably a reason why you're at a session for writing clearly and concisely for science, right? Maybe you're in a science course. What is something maybe you want to achieve? And you can also unmute yourself if that's easier and just share out loud. Thank you, Aubrey. Bray, to get better at backing up my arguments as well as expressing clearly what I want to say. Excellent, yes. And expressing clearly what we want to say is actually a lot more challenging than we think often. It sounds so clear in our heads, but it's often harder when we try to actually get it out, share with other folks. More concise in report writing, excellent. Awesome. So it sounds like clarity and concision are both really important, which is great because those are actually two things that we're going to talk about here. So these are my 4 main points that I want to cover in this hour. Thank you, Megan. So one goal of writing, doing my grammar skills and paraphrasing better and more concision. Excellent. So we're going to talk about how writing is a process, how we can make our science writing more clear, how we can make it more concise, and more objective. So we're actually going to hit on, it sounds like kind of all of the things that you guys mentioned in your chat. The first thing though that I want to talk about is the process of writing. So writing isn't stagnant. We don't just write something, then we're done with it. I think often students do that for their writing. But to be a good writer, we often have to write something more than once. So we write something out and then we have to edit it. So we can't expect perfection from our first draft, right? We need to revise and understand that that first time that we create content, it might not be very good, right? We often have to change it in some way to make it more clear and concise and objective. So with that in mind, I want us to actually write a little bit. We're not going to write a lot, but we're going to write a little bit in this workshop. And we don't have to write for 3 minutes. Maybe we'll just give it like a minute or two. But I want us to have something to work with as we go through the other activities in this workshop. So we want to get some content down so that we can work with it while I'm discussing the other main points. So what I'll do is set a very quick timer, let's say 2 minutes rather than 3, just to keep it nice and concise. And we're going to think about what are some of the significant challenges students face today? What are some helpful strategies for overcoming those challenges? And I'm not going to ask you to share this writing unless you want to. So this is for you. I won't know, right? But it will make your life a lot easier if you spend those 2 minutes writing something down so that we can edit it as we go. So I'll set the timer for 2 minutes. And again, we're thinking about the most significant challenges facing students today. You can think about just yourself if you'd like. What are my challenges in school? And what are some helpful strategies for overcoming those challenges? This is just a prompt to get you writing, right? If you want to write about something else, that's fine too. So I'll start the timer now. And again, I'll just do 2 minutes rather than 3, just so that we can get to our other activities. So I'll be quiet so that we have some writing time. And I will let you know when we have about 30 seconds left. Looks like maybe one person joined while I was explaining. So we're writing right now using the prompt on the screen. It's going to take about 2 minutes to complete that activity. If there's something more interesting, you can write about that instead. That's fine. So about 30 seconds left, so finish up whatever last thought you have there. All right, and 10 seconds left, so just finish whatever last sentence you're working on. And then I would love to hear, just out of instructor curiosity, if you want to share maybe what's something that you wrote down. What is a significant student struggle in 2023? Maybe somebody included. So time is up, and I'd love to hear if anybody would like to share. Were there anything that came up as a significant student struggle? And you don't have to share if you don't want to. This has been an interesting activity because I've done it the last couple of times, and different things seem to come up each time. So we've had different challenges depending on the year. All right, so feel free to share that if you'd like. Now let's go ahead and keep going. So our second point, we're going to come back to that, what you just wrote, and we're going to edit a little bit as we go. So one of the most important things about science writing is that it's concise. So we want to try to take as little time to get to the point as possible. And we're really just communicating the facts. So when we communicate, we want to try to eliminate redundancy where we can. And there's a couple of specific strategies we can use to eliminate redundancy. We can look for overused words, and we can look for the overuse of prepositions. So just so that we're all on the same page, and I apologize if this is sort of oversimplistic, but kind of revisiting, but can somebody give me an example of a preposition just in the chat? What's a preposition? Maybe just throw a random example in the chat. Good. Thank you, Scott. On, for, good. To, right? You probably remember the preposition tree, right? So all the different directions of, on, for, good. Excellent. So I just want to make sure we're all familiar because I've actually had several people ask before, what is a preposition? So prepositions are really important pieces of language. They're also often very overused. So often by finagling our sentences a little bit, we can get rid of some of those prepositions and we can make our sentences more clear. Because something interesting about prepositions is actually the more prepositions we have in a sentence, the more we're often making our reader think to understand that sentence. Because it often means we're kind of taking a while to get to the point and to what we want to say. So let's think about how we can eliminate that redundancy. So we can look for overused words and phrases. So often when I write, I am absolutely terrible about doing exactly what I talked about, getting to the point, right? So I tend to go on little tangents. So I look for multiple uses of a word. Control F is really helpful. And then I just highlight those. And I will then go back and I'll see if I can replace those words, or maybe I can take them out altogether. A word that I use way more than I probably should is that. And then I often overuse prepositions too. So here's an example of what a overuse of prepositions might look like. The purpose of the study of biopsychology is to explore human cognition, emotions, and behavior that result from biological and psychological mechanisms. So we could simplify this a little bit and say biopsychology is the study of the interaction between biological and psychological mechanisms underlying cognition, emotions, and behavior. And you can see there the difference. We have changed the sentence so that the subject of the sentence is front and center by eliminating that preposition. So these are two really important ways that we can remove that redundancy, but also make our writing shorter and more concise. And it also helps with clarity as well. So again, looking for overused words and phrases and eliminating overuse of prepositions. So let's go ahead and try this out together. So let's take a look at this sentence. The reason for this paper is to introduce the main functions of neurons and what factors determine the functions of neurons. So let's think about how we could make this sentence a little bit more concise. So just go ahead and write that out in the chat. You don't have to press enter yet. Just see if you can write this as a nice, concise sentence. So remember, see how can we maybe eliminate one of those prepositions or reword the sentence so that it's a little bit more clear. So we're not reusing words maybe. So write that out in the chat if you could. And then no need to press enter yet. I'll have you press enter in a second. Just take maybe 30 seconds and see if we can rewrite this in the chat. And if you just entered, we're taking a look at a sentence that could use some work. It's maybe not as concise as it could be. So we're going to try to remove maybe some words that are, or rework the sentence so we don't have to reuse words, and maybe see if we can remove some prepositions. All right, so if you have something already, go ahead and press enter, or you can keep working. So let's see if anybody was able to rewrite that sentence. If you still need some time, that's fine. Take a couple more seconds to take a look at this phrase. So we originally have the reason for this paper is to introduce the main functions of neurons and what factors determine the functions of neurons. So let's start here. Do we see any words maybe that are used more than once? Does anybody notice anything? Function. Good. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe there's one more word in there, so we can just circle function. Functions, right? Neurons, exactly right. Yep. So we want to see if we can maybe combine so we don't need to use function and neurons twice, right? So can anybody think, and you can say it out loud too, you don't need to type it out if you don't want to. How might we rewrite this so that it's a little bit more concise? Anybody think of a way of rewriting the sentence? So let's take a, oh, perfect. Thank you, Hector. The reason for this paper is to introduce the main functions and factors of neurons. Good. Excellent. Yes, we took out a good portion of this paper, right? So we don't really need to include the reason for, right? Because that's redundant. It's already included in the sentence, right? If we're going to be introducing something, then we're telling somebody what the reason is. So this paper, we can start there, will, right? Will introduce the main functions and factors, or the main functions and factors, or the main factors that determine the functions of neurons, right? So there's a couple of different ways that we could put this, but there's lots of ways to make it more concise. So does that make sense? Are there any questions about what we did here? Yeah, no, Hector, I think you did a great job. Okay, this paper introduces neuron functions and factors determining these functions. Excellent. That's also a perfect. Can we have ChatGPT do this? Well, that's kind of a loaded question. I mean, yes, certainly if it's not something you need to turn in for a grade, you definitely can. If you're turning it in for a grade, then I would not recommend. No. But it can certainly be a helpful tool for writing emails or other things, right? All right, so let's take a crack very quickly. Maybe just we'll take 1 minute at your own writing. So we'll give it just a minute. See if you can find something in your own writing, maybe that you can make a little bit more concise. And again, think about repetitive words or phrases and highlight prepositions and think about, are they used correctly? And do we have too many of them? Can I shrink this sentence so that it is it's a little bit more concise? So I'm going to go ahead and start the timer now, and we'll take a look at our own writing. And I'll let you know when we have about 10 seconds left. All right, and about 10 seconds left. So just see if you can identify anything else in your paper you might maybe would want to make it a little bit more concise. All right, so any other questions about these activities or about eliminating prepositions, phrases, etc., or overused phrases? And I should give that question its due, Hector, because actually using something like ChatGPT to get better at our writing isn't a bad idea as long as it's not submitted for a grade. I don't see anything wrong with working on your own writing, right? Because it gives you a good sense of what sort of words you maybe overuse and what sort of prepositions maybe you don't understand properly, that sort of thing. So it's not a terrible idea as long as you're not submitting it as academic work. All right, so let's go to our, all right. So let's go to our third point. So one of the most important parts of science writing is its clarity. Remember that when we're communicating, we're often not just communicating to the small circle of folks in our scientific circle. So, and as an example of how small that is, in my little field, there's less than 200 people in the whole world that study exactly what I study. So often when people are reading my paper, right, they're not going to be one of those 200 people necessarily. I'm sure those people read it too, but often it's going to be folks outside of that circle who don't necessarily understand the jargon that I might want to use and are going to be relying on that clarity to understand my ideas. So to ensure that our writing is clear, the number one thing that we can do is make sure that we're using the active voice. When we use the passive voice in our writing, it makes it much more difficult for somebody to understand the point that you're trying to get across. And actually, there's really good, neuroscience is my area of expertise, right? There's actually some really good research that looks at how the brain processes these types of writing. And actually, the brain works much harder when it's trying to read something that's written in passive voice. So active voice, let's go to our next slide here, is when the subject is doing the action. And passive voice is often when an indirect object is doing the action, right? So, and I'm sorry if I'm not stating that as clearly as I can, Tasha, because I know you're the English expert here, but hopefully that's a sufficient explanation. So let me give you an example of the active voice. The scientist wrote a clear and concise research report. So the scientist is the one doing the action of writing the research report, as opposed to the clear and concise research report was written by the scientist. So if you read those two, right, when we read the passive sentence, it gets all the way until the end until we know what exactly has actually been done. So if we can put that right up at the front, it makes it much easier for somebody to understand exactly what you're trying to convey, but it also requires less words to convey exactly the same information. So when we can, use the active voice. Any questions about active versus passive voice? Is that clear? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the sentence. So this is something that's written in passive voice. The biology homework was submitted by the exhausted student at midnight. I think a lot of us can probably relate. So how can we go about turning this around so that it's written in active versus passive voice? So feel free to just submit in the chat. I'm going to ask for you to hold off. Good. Exactly. Yep. So we want to start with the subject, right? So what's the subject of our sentence? The exhausted student, right? Exactly. The exhausted student submitted their biology homework at midnight. Perfect. Right? Because the biology homework is the indirect object here. Excellent. So it makes sense right here. When we turn things around, we need less words, but it also means that who's doing the thing? The exhausted student, right? So we don't have to read further than that to know what is doing the action. Hopefully that makes some sense. So any questions about this? There's a caveat. Okay, I'm interested to hear the caveat. Yeah, so in general, better to use the active voice. Now, I will say something. If you are trying to make your writing interesting, there's a case to be made for using active and passive voice. In science, we want to rely on the active voice because remember, our number one goal, communicating clearly rather than interestingly. And once we get really good at communicating clearly, then we can start to develop our own voice and make things more interesting as well. When referring more sentences, then we need to say he, she, or it. Yeah, sure. That's absolutely true. So if we're making a more complex sentence, that's true. Often with science, we break things up into multiple sentences rather than creating really long ones, or we should. I won't say scientists actually do. I think we're actually known for long run-on sentences, but in general, you should make them straight and to the point. Students submitted 10 projects. Students submitted 10 projects. The first project was, yeah, no, that would be totally acceptable. For the second sentence to start the first project was. That's a good question. All right. So any other questions? Oops, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Any other questions about active and passive? That's a great question, Hector. So he's asking about the follow-up to the active. And often this is the first sentence of a paragraph, right? And then you use the following sentences in that paragraph to describe that first main point. But it's important that that first main point is in the active voice because it makes it clear. Hopefully that makes sense. That's a good question. All right, so let's go ahead and take a second. We'll take a minute and we'll look at our own writing. Now, if you came in a little bit later, you don't have writing to work with, and you can either look at writing that you've already done, or you can take this as a free minute. Up to you. So we wrote some work at the very beginning. We're going to go ahead and take a look at that and see if we have anything, maybe highlight something that's written in the passive. See if this is maybe something that we struggle with. I know it's something that I often have to revise for. So I already started the timer. I'll let you know when there's about 10 seconds left. As a reminder, we're just looking through our work, maybe highlighting anything that we see is written in the passive. And change it if you have time. And so yeah, if you don't have anything you wrote with us, you can look at old writing, chill and drink your coffee or tea or your water. We have about 15 seconds left. All right, 5 seconds to just finish with your highlighting. That's what we're doing. All right, awesome. So I'm just curious, did anybody find that this was something that they do a lot of? Is this their writing issue, writing in the passive? Scott, you said yes. Yeah, this is my number one writing issue, actually. I tend to find when I go back through to edit that most of my paper is written in the passive, even though I make an attempt when I'm first writing it to write in the active. All right, so let's go ahead. Just submitted my dossier. Now I'm wondering. I know. Yeah, I think it probably took me 8 rounds of editing before I got to a place where I wanted to submit my dossier. Try to write in passive because it is less aggressive. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Hector made a very good point. When you write in science, it's going to feel really weird and unnatural because we don't generally speak this way. Maybe we do, right? Some of us really like clarity in everyday conversations and emails, and that's fine too. But often, and it depends on cultures too, which is really interesting. So in certain cultures, especially collectivistic cultures, we tend to speak in the passive. We tend to write emails in the passive because exactly what he's saying, it tends to come off as less aggressive, right? It's toned down. And so it's going to feel weird. It's going to feel weird when you write for science because remember, we're trying to prioritize clarity, concision, and getting information across rather than it being interesting or softer to read, right? So it does take some practice before we get to a place where that feels more natural when we're writing science. And it takes a mental shift, honestly. Yeah, definitely, Scott. I would say that's something we prioritize and why softening our tone. Great point. All right, so our fourth point. Yeah, no, you're not alone, Hector. And actually, it's interesting. It's almost like code switching or something because once you've written, when you're working on a writing project. So when I was writing my last manuscript, I would then try to write emails the way that I had been writing, and I have to go back and rewrite them. So it almost takes this weird mental shift going back and forth. So our fourth point is objectivity and removing bias. So when we write science, we want to be as objective as possible, as unbiased as possible. So we want to remember that scientists come from lots of different backgrounds, and they all need to be able to understand our work. And that means that we want to be as formal as possible, right? And as unbiased as possible, so that when they're reading our work, even if they might come from a different cultural background, they can still understand, and also so that we're not offending people that we might potentially work with in the future, right? So there's lots of ways that we can do this. We can cite our evidence to make sure that we're remaining unbiased and we're not just using our own opinions in our work, avoid filler or emotionally charged words, and trying not to overuse adverbs is also really important. So let's go to our examples here. So we can, when we write, we want to try to avoid expletives, obviously, right? I think that's a given, unless you're studying expletives, in which case, by all means, labeling terms, slang, right? Filler words. Avoiding first-person pronouns is contentious, and it depends on what sort of formatting you're using. In APA formatting, you're not actually explicitly told to avoid first-person pronouns anymore, according to the most recent what's the word I'm looking for, edition of that formatting. But in general, we want to try to avoid it because it can make our language, our paper less clear. So for example, in my opinion, I think such and such, right? We want to try to avoid something that's stated from our own point of view, and try to remove informal phrases where possible. We also, if we're writing a response, we always want to address another scientist's ideas rather than them specifically. So we want to make it about cool science, right? Less about necessarily the other scientist. And that way we can stay collegial, but also keep things fairly formal. It's also really easy to overuse adverbs, especially when you first start writing something for a scientific audience, excuse me. So these are words like actually, really, generally, mostly, barely, very, right? And I often see students use a lot of reallys in their work because that's often how we write. There's nothing wrong with that. We just want to try to avoid it where possible because it's an unnecessary word, and it's imprecise. So as an example, I believe the results that schizophrenics had a harder time with the memory task was very significant. Instead, we can say individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia scored significantly lower on the memory task than individuals without the diagnosis. I want to note that first part of the sentence. Often folks will use what we call labeling terms, and in science, we want to try to avoid that. So rather than saying something like schizophrenics, which actually labels the person as their diagnosis, especially in psychology, we separate those two things. So rather than schizophrenics, it's individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia. There are specific audiences for which we don't follow that rule. One of the most notable is folks with autism. So more recently, they've claimed the term autistic, and so therefore we use autistic folks, right? Or even autistic sometimes if that's what they prefer. All right. So yeah, just coming back to removing bias where we can, right? Removing labels is really important. So any questions about this particular slide? So overusing adverbs, right? Removing slang, filler words, etc. So often the number one, oh, sorry, I interrupted something. Go for it. Okay, I thought somebody was about to speak, but it's fine. So one of the biggest questions I get often from my students when they're studying research methods or statistics is, how do I develop an academic tone? Like, how do I write formally? I don't really understand what exactly that looks like because I've never written formally before. I've never written academically before. And my number one suggestion to develop your own sort of academic tone or to understand what that even looks like is to read a lot of academic work. it'll get easier and easier to write in that particular tone, to understand science when you read it, if you just do a lot of scientific reading, right? And it's going to be a very steep slope because when we first read scientific writing, it's often very hard to digest because it looks, right, it feels unnatural to write, but it also often feels unnatural to read in the beginning. And scientists are not always well known for being the clearest writers, unfortunately. And so sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get through and digest some of the things that are written, which is why it's so important, right? When we're thinking about becoming scholars ourselves, right? That we're putting in the time to be good writers too, so that we're not contributing to other people's difficulty reading our work. We want to be clear and concise and get our points across and share good science, right? So yeah, read lots of science if you really want to develop a good academic tone. So let's go ahead and take a look at this sentence and see if we can find ways to make it maybe a little bit more, a little bit less biased and a little bit more objective. So basically, dyslexics are generally better at emotional regulation, which is really cool, which is something that maybe we might share with a friend. Probably not how we should write in an academic article. So how might we change that? Again, we're highlighting objectivity and we want to be as unbiased as possible. So what might we take out, rearrange? Just take a cool, sorry. What do we think? Does anything jump out at us here as being particularly biased or less objective? Yeah, absolutely. The so definitely smacks of like texting, right? We don't generally start our sentences with so. So basically, might be something we say to a friend when we're picking up a conversation. Right, so we might want to remove that phrase. So basically, so we're going to start with the meat of the sentence. What about that next word, dyslexics? How could we phrase that differently? Good, yeah, people with dyslexia, people with dyslexia, individuals with dyslexia, however you want to phrase that, are generally better at emotional regulation, which is really cool. What else do we want to remove here? There's a lot, we'll say, in this particular sentence. Yep, generally, we don't need that, right? We want to be as precise as possible. What does generally mean? I don't know. If we have a percentage there, we could include it. So individuals with dyslexia are 3 times better at are or 50% of individuals with dyslexia or whatever it is that we have our precise science, right? We're often conveying information. Let's convey the information we have precisely as possible. So individuals with dyslexia are better at emotional regulation, which is really cool. Anything else we want to get rid of? Absolutely. Yep. And we don't need our opinion, right? I mean, our opinion is something we can convey maybe in person, but we can let people read it and think it's really cool. So individuals with dyslexia are better at emotional regulation. And we would want to define what that means, right? Because better is very imprecise. So we want to follow this up with information about what we mean there. All right, so any questions there about any of those things that we just did? So removing our adverb, right? Taking out our opinion, taking out our labeling term with dyslexics, changing it to individuals with dyslexia. All right. So any questions then, though, about being formal, formal writing, what goes, what doesn't go, about removing bias from our writing more generally. So let me ask this then. What part of the writing process that we just went through, right? So we went through those four main points, did we find most difficult? And why was that? So of all of these that we just covered, right? Clarity, concision, making things less biased, more formal. What part of that was the most difficult? For me, it's always been concision. So I am not a concise writer. And generally, when I go from my first to my second edition, I'll lose a good 30 or 40% of what I've written. Yeah, exactly, Scott. Concision is tricky because there's so many interesting things to say, right? And we want to say all of them. And it's very hard to stick to one particular topic sometimes, or even to convey that topic concisely. Good. And honestly, formality can be tricky sometimes too, because it's, like Hector was talking about before with passive versus active, we don't usually speak formally. Some of us do, but most of the time we don't speak super formally. And so that's a change, right? Going from the way we speak to the way we write. It's a very different way of conveying information. Got it. All right. Well, that is the vast majority of what I have for you today. So hopefully you took something away from that. Um, as somebody who's about to grade a lot of papers, I just want to highlight those prepositions because that is the thing that tends to get students every time. And I can't tell you how many times I have to rework phrases or we have to change things up just because, there's a little less understanding sometimes about like how to use prepositions and where to put them, that sort of thing. So take another look at maybe your writing and make sure that you're good to go there. But yeah, any questions that you have for me about writing for science more generally, or about anything that we covered? One of the best things about science, right, is that we always have questions and we're always curious. Awesome. I'm glad it was helpful for you, Megan. All right, wonderful. Well, if that is the case, then I will give you back these last 15 minutes and you can enjoy an additional 15 minutes of your Wednesday.
Right. Thank you so much. Mahalo, everyone. Don't forget to complete our feedback form that is in the chat box. We'll go ahead and post it one more time, especially if you are receiving extra credit for today's session. We will need to know your instructor's name so we can email them and provide that information to them. And also, we just wanted to let you know that we have lots more Success Connection workshops coming up for the remainder of the semester. We have one this Friday on time management, which is a very important skill for all college students to know, not only college students, important for me too. So be sure to check those out. But other than that, mahalo everyone for attending today. I'm going to go ahead and stop